In Nikolai Berdyayev's over 2 books, The Meaning of the Creative Act, 1916, and The New Middle Ages, 1924, framed the experience of the Russian Revolution. Between these 2 books, both marking watershed moments in the philosopher's own development, Berdyaev witnessed and experienced the First World War. The first book was written in 1914 in Switzerland. The February and October revolutions of 1917, the Civil War, and his own forced exile from Russia in 1922. My paper is, unlike many other presentations at this conference, not a study in the history of philosophy. Rather, I approach Berdyayev's arguments as a fellow philosopher and address them similarly to how I would address the arguments of those gathered around this table. My focus is further on Berdyayev's philosophy of history and philosophy of art. My remarks here today stem from my book, my work on the book, where I delve into the driving forces of modern history viewed through their relation with the arts. These remarks, in other words, have a background that I cannot bring out fully in my presentation, but I hope to explain as far as I can in my answers to your questions. Смысл творчества, the meaning of the creative act, is Berdyayev's defense of the human person, Anthropodicy, against the unfreedom to which she has been submitted according to him. His philosophy of history provides the necessary framing for his argument. His philosophy of art is the beating heart of the entire endeavor. Berdyaev chooses as his point of departure from whence he then derives all his evaluations and interpretations of historical developments, a half-doctrine, half-myth about the 3 periods of sacred history, the era of necessity and law, the era of redemption, and the era of creativity. The first era corresponds to the period from man's fall to the appearance of Jesus Christ, the second from the appearance of Christ to the present, Berdyayev's moment, and the third era is in store for us, and we stand on its threshold, if, that is, we correctly grasp the meaning of this moment. To disclose this meaning is the task of the book. This simple scheme does not, of course, exhaust the entire picture, but it is present everywhere in Berdyayev's text, and his entire critique of science, philosophy, religion, social relations, and art is correlated with it. I should also note that Berdyaev has no trace of the concern about the vacuity and formlessness of beginnings that is so strong in Hegel's thought. The Russian philosopher shoots the truth from a pistol, as Hegel used to remark about some of his contemporaries. This imparts from the start, and this is not a pun, a peculiar quality to Berdyayev's entire enterprise, namely, it can be called philosophy only with serious qualifications. Given the structure of the text, Berdyaev walks a thin line between philosophy, which does not recognize any limits to its analyses, and theology, which consists in the extraction of rational meanings and implications from a set of dogmas themselves rooted in the mythology, that provide the ultimate ground for its exercises. More often than not, and despite many valuable insights, Berdyayev's thought travels through the territory across the line from philosophy. Berdyayev's mythology is a modification of the Christian myth, a creative reworking of it in the spirit of the mystics whom he chooses as his forebears and whom he cites copiously. The fabric of the myth is woven of several threads. Its basic pattern is derived from the Bible, but this pattern is then heavily embroidered by medieval and modern Germanic mysticism, from Meister Eckhart to Franz Baader to Rudolf Steiner. The mythical consciousness, the very process by which Berdyaev articulated his thoughts was indicative of the primacy of mythical consciousness over philosophical reflection. In his method, he repeatedly confessed that rather than building arguments and proving his point, he started with something that his insight convinced him to be true and indubitable, and proceeded from it. Further, this mythology derives much inspiration from precisely the modernist thinking about history and art, the influence that is especially evident, for example, in Berdyayev's doctrine in Berdyayev's notion of creativity. Aphorisms such as "the nature of genius is always revolutionary," and "genius is the sainthood of daring rather than sainthood of obedience," echo throughout the 20th century and today on the pages of numerous catalogues and critical commentary for every exhibition of avant-garde art. But this cult of groundbreaking genius is mixed in Berdyaev's books with the pre-modern motifs. Quote, "The creative experience of artistic genius," he writes, for example, "will be acknowledged as religiously equal in value to the ascetic experience of sainthood." This will happen, according to Berdyaev's theory, when art makes the transition to theurgy, the general outline of which he borrowed from Vladimir Solovyov and considerably enhanced and expanded it in accordance with the historical scheme that lay at the foundation of his argument. The main idea of this part of Berdyaev's doctrine consists in the proposal that whereas art previously created only cultural values, in its future capacity as theurgy, it will become the creation of, quote, life itself and, quote, real being. Berdyaev's vision of history is hard to accept for many reasons, one of which being that it grossly misdiagnosed the nature of the historical moment, but also because it requires an uncritical acceptance of Berdyaev's highly personalized version of the Christian myth. In the course of my own inquiries into the history of the arts and philosophical ideas in the modern period, I have come to rely on a different set of propositions, which I would briefly summarize as follows. Modernity, that is the historical period from the early 17th to the late 20th centuries, is the site of the struggle of what Hegel called divine powers when he described the nature of tragedy. On the one hand, there are the old pre-modern and parallel non-modern holistic worldviews, and on the other hand, there is the new modern infinitist view of the world. The modern outlook created itself by a series of profound inversions of its pre-modern and non-modern counterparts, where the pre- and non-modern outlooks perceived the world as an integral whole. The modern mind asserted a non-world, constituted by time and space stretching to infinity in all directions, that is, by definition, not whole. Where the pre- and non-modern subject saw a world ruled by a transcendent supreme power, the modern subject asserted himself as the only living being and therefore the only agent in the entire order of things, with his own will and purpose. Where the pre- and non-modern community centered itself on the mystery of lying at the heart of this order, the modern subject advanced the vision of infinite progress of science and technology in the service of his own power. Throughout modern history, we see epic collision of these divine powers. The cultural and political fabric of modern history is woven of their intertwining threads. The Russian Silver Age was one episode in this 4-century-long conflict. There had been the religious philosophical struggles of the 17th century erupting on the political surface of history into religious and civil wars. There had been the rise of Romanticism as a reaction to the abstract dogmas of the Enlightenment, erupting into revolutions and vast military conflicts that we call the Napoleonic Wars. The era of the Russian Silver Age saw yet another attempt by the culture of modern age to overcome the relentless fragmentation of the world, society, and the human subject forced upon the entire order of things by what Alexei Losev called modern mythology, that is, the mythical underpinnings of the immanentist, infinitist outlook I have just described. On the political surface of history, this new collision of divine powers of these two thoroughly opposed types of worldviews manifested itself as a series of social revolutions, the First World War and the Russian Civil War of 1918-1922. And as we were reminded by some of the speakers yesterday, by other similar events outside Russia, those conflicts were marked by unprecedented violence and destruction, but tragically, the violence resolved nothing, and the clash was soon repeated with even greater destruction and even more merciless violence, now truly on a global scale. Need I mention that once again, all this violence failed to resolve the basic underlying conflict. And today we find ourselves embroiled yet again in the ongoing struggle of worldviews, and religion is once again at the heart of the struggle, even in the confidently secular societies, or so it would seem, like those of the so-called developed nations of Europe and North America. This is my way of saying that the topic of the Russian Revolution is not at all an academic matter, smoldered by historical dust and slowly giving up the ghost in the stuffy quarters of an armchair bookworm like me. The ideas, symbols, and myths that brought it into being are very much part and parcel of today's realities. Rising against the oppressive hegemony of positivism and philosophical materialism, the followers of Vladimir Solovyov launched a thoroughgoing critique of the modern outlook as a whole. The rise of Russian religious philosophical thought was an act of conscious resistance to the modern forces of fragmentation and relentless progress understood in purely external quantitative terms. The philosophers who belonged to this school, as well as the artists who were inspired by symbolist ideas and sensibility, argued, envisioned, and advocated for a socio-cultural transformation that would overcome the centrifugal thrust of modern thinking. On the political surface of things, they lost their battle. Their opponents won, and went on to establish a thoroughly modernist regime that directed Russia's resources and energy to carving the country's largely unmodern body by the merciless violence of massive social engineering into a modern nation bent on overtaking the rest of the modern world in the race of progress. Berdyaev's philosophy of creativity belongs to that current in modern history which serves as a counterpoint to immanentist infinitism. To call this current conservative or revolutionary would mean to surrender it to immanentist infinitism itself, to cast its critique in the terms that exclude any perspective other than the one stemming from the object of the critique. Immanentist infinitism is, in turn, both a tool in the hands and part of the essence of the voluntaristic rationalist subject that constituted the dominant form of subjectivity in modern history. Berdyaev belongs to those thinkers who refuse to accept this form of the human subject and all the ideas about the basic aspects of the modern outlook that flow from it. The presence of this current in the modern history of ideas suggests a different story than the one offered either by the unabashed progressivists or those who saw modern progress as decline, or even the postmodern critics of both. The story seems to be, rather, one of a continuing interaction between the dominant modern human subject and various avatars of pre-modern and non-modern conceptions of the human person that persist alongside modern progressivism. This interaction takes the forms of resistance, partial syntheses, and even recoiling or withdrawal when the pre- and non-modern outlooks are not simply destroyed by the march of progress and swept aside as so much debris. But even where and when the modern subject manages completely to dominate, the irrationalities of its own internal conceptual dynamics give rise to reactions and internal fragmentation that result in immanent critique, as happened with post-structuralism that became the modern subject's own attempt to cleanse itself without giving up its own most treasured essence. Berdyaev's Manichaean dualism and his infatuation with antinomic contrasts would have driven him to less regrettable errors if he could resolve the oppositions that he so eloquently set up in a dialectical manner rather than insisting on the supremacy of mysticism. For example, in his mystically inspired spiritualist metaphysics, he demoted nature, the material world, and man's practical activity to an extremely low level, and as a result, hastily pronounced the decline of the era of materialism and capitalism. This was the theme of the new Middle Ages. A century later, we are confronted with an even less agreeable countenance of these forces. In the meantime, they have become responsible for even more horrifying atrocities than those that provoked Berdyaev's prophecy in the first place. The dualism shows especially in Berdyaev's understanding of the symbol. Culture, he writes, is symbolic by its nature. Only the symbols, signs of the other world are given in it, but not that other world itself. I can cite numerous other similar statements from both the Смысл творчества and Новое Средневековье, where Berdyaev declares this thesis about the essence of the symbol and symbolism. His treatment of this concept is directly opposed to the understanding of it that we find in Vyacheslav Ivanov, Florensky, and Lossev, where the symbol is the encounter between heaven and earth, spirit and matter, meaning and form. Berdyaev, but by contrast, almost polemically foregrounds his disagreement with this view, and this polemical objection is itself a symbol of Berdyaev's general outlook. Berdyaev's antinomic mystical philosophy shows that all he learned from dialectical philosophical thought is thrust aside as the ultimate and at the ultimate and most important moment in the name of the great divine mystery and the final Coincidentia oppositorum is possible only within this divine mystery while remaining forever unattainable to reason. The tension between pre-modern and modern worldviews is the live nerve of Berdyaev's thinking. Excuse me. Its current passes through his philosophy of history and his philosophy of art. In philosophy of history, Berdyaev wishes to transform progressive time into sacred one, and conversely, sacred time into progressive one. In philosophy of art, he wishes to transform life-shaping ritual into a work of art, and vice versa. This tension is not resolved by Berdyaev. When he tries to resolve it, he slips into good old mysticism, while the rest of the time his thought moves along the familiar progressivist lines. The tension is the most interesting thing in Berdyaev's philosophy of creativity. It is also potentially the most productive thing in it, if it is translated into the language of the current debate about art and morality, aesthetics and ethics. Zienkovsky was right when he noted the overall moralistic character of Berdyaev's way of thinking. Berdyaev constantly teaches, Zienkovsky wrote, insists, accuses and summons. The moralist in him is always evident, end quote. The key here is how one resolves the dilemma of the ludic and the serious. A great error about the ontological nature of art pervades the entire modern history, despite Kant's epoch-making insights into the nature of aesthetic judgment. More than 2 centuries since his third critique, art continues to be seen as ontologically identical with reality. Neither the romanticism in the immediate aftermath of Kant's aesthetics, nor the defined aestheticism of a century later succeeded in overcoming this error. The ontological identity of art and life is the root of what can be termed aesthetic moralism, of all stripes, political, ideological and religious, encompassing all orientations. This moralism dominates today's academic discourse about the arts, imposing on scholarship the assumption that art directly projects political and ideological meanings, and that its most relevant function is as a weapon in ideological critique and political power struggles. This assumption is typical of the entire ideological spectrum, from ultra-conservatives to ultra-leftist critics, from North American evangelical fundamentalists to gender equality activists, from Taliban to Pussy Riot. Despite such near-universal acceptance, this attitude is philosophically indefensible. Russian philosophical thought about art throughout its existence has been under the spell of this moralism, and only a handful of thinkers and artists could resist its power. Nikolai Berdyaev's meaning of the creative act is a battlefield where a genuine understanding of the nature of art struggles to emerge through the layers of moralistic thinking that are pressing it down, and the fires of this battle illuminate the later destiny of art down to the current moment. Insisting on the importance of the serious principle alone, one in fact strips it of its seriousness and its defining quality. Excessive seriousness with regard to life threatens, in other words, to turn this life negatively into play. This is precisely what we find in the so-called democratic literary and cultural criticism in the Russia of the 1860s. When Dmitry Pisarev, Nikolai Dobrolyubov and Nikolai Chernyshevsky insist on the primacy of the serious principle in art, that is, on art's socio-utilitarian function, they in fact begin to transform, without realizing it, life itself into a plaything in the hands of man the technologist. Technologist, because in their chosen system of coordinates, art as such cannot exist at all, and only technology exists as the practical implementation of scientific knowledge. It may seem that Berdyaev's religious outlook has nothing in common with the progressivism of populist Democrats and Konstantin Mikhailovsky's critically thinking individuals, but they do come together precisely in extolling this serious principle over and above its ludic counterpart. Berdyaev is no doubt more sensitive to the uniquely specific nature of art. He absorbed deeply Friedrich Schiller's insight into this nature, and in the end he still wishes that art be transformed into serious religious activity. But here one finds the same dialectic at work as in the case of populist moralist. When the serious religious attitude to things fully subsumes the ludic one, the former loses its outline precisely as serious. Sacred act fuses with the profane one and becomes indistinguishable from it. The priest needs the fool just as much as the fool needs the priest. They each lose their essence without each other. Further, Berdyaev understands religion in none other than moralistic key. Religion is life, serious practical activity designed to guide the human person to her supreme ideal, to make the human being equal to its now hidden divine essence, the absolute. Play in art has for Berdyaev a dual significance. On the other hand, it makes the human person free, but on the other hand, on the other hand, this freedom is strictly limited. Berdyaev comes very close to the idea that the ludic principle must be assimilated to the serious one when play finally summons its own original surmounts, its own original limitation, and the human being becomes free in reality rather than merely within the strict confines of play. But in the decisive moment, when one needs to peer into this final synthesis, Berdyaev's thinking swerves back to its habitual moralistic course. This course belongs in the final analysis to the domain of practical reason. It is the course of myth rather than poetry. But according to the essential nature of things which I described above, no return is possible from the domain of absolute spirit to the kingdom of practical reason. Both the world of and life and morality have already been subjected to the repeated transformative action of ludic art. Berdyaev himself, in his own spiritual intellectual constitution, is a product of this deep historical action, and Zienkovsky was right to group him with romantics, finding in him the typical features of the romantic subject. This is accurate in more ways than Zienkovsky indicated. Berdyaev is not only constantly absorbed in his own subjective reactions to the world, as Zienkovsky correctly points out, but he in fact strives to fulfill the young Friedrich Schiller's romantic program of the romantic program of the new mythology. He attempts to articulate a new Christian myth. This is what he writes about philosophy and myth. God's beneficent assistance in philosophical cognition, without which the integral and ultimate truth cannot be attained, cannot be the method of philosophy. It can only be a gift sent for the creative labor of cognition. But philosophy must restore the original truth of the mythological nature of human consciousness. Philosophy itself freely acknowledges that the world can only be cognized mythologically. End quote. But it is not difficult to know that what Berdyaev takes as such points of departure can be considered myth only in a very qualified sense. These indubitable truths attained by immediate insight are in fact complex structures that do indeed comprise shreds of old myths, and yet these myths are modified and rearranged by philosophical reflection in order to provide answers, usually to questions that Berdyaev's antinomic mystical method cannot provide. I call such constructs, whether in Plato's dialogues or in Vladimir Solovyov or in Alexei Losov, mythosophy, mythical idiom deployed to complete a philosophical argument or doctrine, to crown a philosophical edifice in such a manner that myth and philosophical reflection are seamlessly joined into an integral totality. Berdyaev's mythosophy rounds out his entire philosophical approach. The intuitivism with which it begins serves as a ground for philosophical structures which culminate in the return to the mystical intuitivism of mythical consciousness. The obvious weakness of this procedure lies precisely in its mystical phase. The black box of divine mystery can spew out unpredictable things, which is another way of saying that the mystic fills divine mystery with his or her own content rooted in immediately held beliefs and uncritically derived from his or her sociocultural environment. Martin Heidegger's somewhat similar philosophical procedure led him into traps and pitfalls that have since become notorious. Describing Berdyaev's sense of the revolutionary moment, Viktor Bычkov notes the tragic motif in it. The tension between the surface and the underground of culture has finally reached threatening magnitude, and the explosion is imminent both in society and in culture. Berdyaev first wrote about it in the early years of the 20th century. He then correctly remarks, "Today, a century later, we know that the entire past century became in fact such an interminable catastrophic explosion of culture, as a result of which culture's underground reigns supreme today, where a century ago one found its smoothed-out surface. I should note to this that when we hear at the end of the 20th century the most varied voices announcing the end of history, whether in art or in politics, we should be aware that they announce the exhaustion of precisely the moral horizon of thought, but not at all of thought as such. Arthur Danto and Francis Fukuyama, Jacques Derrida and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen all think in similar basic categories, and these categories belong in their ultimate depth to practical reason, that is, to the kingdom of will. For all these thinkers and artists, over entire order of things, even when it is viewed as chaos, there flies the triumphal banner of none other than will, rather than reason. Such is the logic of the modern outlook from the beginning, and it finally becomes fully evident, that is, it emerges from the cultural underground, in Bychkov's terms, to the surface, and no one is surprised any longer by this bearing of the metaphysics of the modern subject, in contrast to earlier, more innocent times when this metaphysics could still shock the consciousness that was still too much under the spell of pre-modern values. On the contrary, this logic, the logic of metaphysical voluntarism, is now hailed as the truth that has been finally discovered. Instead of a conclusion, the difference between the meaning of a work of art and the thinking outside the domain of art is not trivial. It is ontological. That is, it touches on the inner nature and the essence of those two types of thinking. It is extremely difficult to distinguish them, and for this reason the difference between them is the cause of numerous disagreements and misunderstandings. Let us take a closer look at the genesis of an idea uttered by a character in a work of art or included in the fabric of the work in some other manner. Igor Yevlampiev has shown, for example, that Dostoevsky's idea of personal immortality was the result of complex and even tortuous searching, but in any event, the writer was concerned with it quite earnestly and completely vitally. Then, from his earnest and vital reflections, Dostoevsky transfers this idea into his literary works and entrusts it, for example, to Kirillov in The Demons. On the one hand, it remains the same idea as in the writer's reflections, but on the other hand, clearly, it is no longer in the earnest and vital space and time. It belongs now to the ludic chronotope of the work of art. Further, this ludic chronotope is itself the product of the evolution of thinking, and is that phase in which thinking surmounts its immediate dependence on the earnest and vital circumstances of life. The next stage in this evolution is the return of thinking from the ludic space back into the earnest and vital domain. As a result of this return, is essentially transformed. Now human thinking is determined not by the immediate earnest and vital circumstances, but on the contrary, it begins to take control of these circumstances and to change them in accordance with those forms that it acquired in the ludic domain. This phase constitutes the essence of what we call culture. Thus, the pre-ludic state of affairs develops into the ludic one and then into the post-ludic one. The pre-ludic phase is sublated into the ludic phase and then is itself sublated in the post-ludic phase, which thus contains in sublated form the preludic and ludic phases within itself. And now this newly arisen post-ludic state of affairs yet again becomes the object of earnest and vital thinking, and then again lifts itself into the ludic realm, and again returns therefrom transformed to the earnest and vital context, transforming it in turn, and this entire process is continuously repeated, constituting the inner logic and dynamic of the history of culture, of that which Hegel called absolute spirit. Thus, thanks to this dialectic of the serious and the ludic principles, any serious philosophical idea harbors in itself multiple ludic phases of its genealogy, and vice versa. Any ludic thought is precisely the same manner, comprises in itself multiple serious phases of its historical and cultural biography. Someone who is insensitive to dialectics will consider this circumstance a cause for identifying these types of ideas. But for a dialectically thinking mind, it is clear as day, if one phase is removed from these relations, where the earnest and vital one or whether the earnest and vital one or the ludic one, the whole movement will stop, the whole edifice will crumble, and the whole meaning will evaporate. The entire edifice of culture and its history will be reduced to absurdity and nonsense. It is therefore advisable to avoid direct and immediate identification of preludic meanings with their ludic counterparts. On the contrary, one should be able to distinguish them and to understand the dialectic of their mutual relation. This means, in turn, that in order to evaluate them correctly, one must clearly see both their essential difference and their essential mutual connection. In my opinion, a rational solution to the dilemma of art and reality can be found only in this manner. Thank you.
Let's have at least 10 minutes for questions. Perhaps even 15.
Absolutely. Sure.
Big one and small one. First, yesterday we had a talk about avant-garde aesthetics, positive aesthetics from Robert Bird, and I have three notions: regeneration, transfiguration, and material incarnation. How these notions you can found by Berdyaev at first, and what is a prime, or what is the first of these three notions by Berdyaev?
Which are the notions again?
Material incarnation, regeneration, and transfiguration.
Well, they are.
This is a fundamental question for Berdyaev and impersonalism at all.
Well, for Berdyaev, these are all theological notions. These are all religiously framed concepts. And he would answer. He describes them in the manner that that is dictated basically by that history, that the historical framework that you find in the Smysl Tvorchestva. That is the three eras, and then Christian theological notions, which in Berdyaev's case are heavily influenced by Germanic mysticism, the mystics. So these would all be mystical events. These material incarnation is Jesus Christ is the model for that, the incarnation, and regeneration and transfiguration are against, ultimately derived from the New Testament, from the Gospel stories. But they are then. There is also the layer of Eckhart, Bader, and Steiner over all these notions. Those are things that Berdyaev obviously prefers to the official Orthodox. I'm sorry, theological treatment of them.